Hello everyone, and thank you for clicking on this video. Are you having trouble falling asleep? You're in the right place. The Scary Nightmare is here to help you find peace before bed. But before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any updates that will help you relax. Now, lie down comfortably, take a deep breath, and let go of any tension. The story is about to begin. Story 1. I had always found solace in the quiet, the peaceful moments of stillness that surrounded me in my small, solitary cabin on the outskirts of town. For years, I had chosen a life of seclusion, seeking refuge from the noise and chaos of the world. My cabin was nestled deep in the forest, far from any signs of civilization. It was the kind of place where the only sounds were the wind rustling the leaves and the occasional chirp of distant wildlife. No cars, no voices, just nature. It was on one particularly cold autumn evening that everything changed. I had been preparing for the upcoming winter. The air was brisk, and the days were growing shorter, as they tend to do in the fall. I had spent the last few days gathering firewood, checking the cabin for any leaks, and securing the windows. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, I made my way into the woods to gather a final few logs for the fire. The ground was wet from the recent rain, and the air smelled of damp earth. The forest was eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the soft chatter of insects. It was as if the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something. I shrugged off the unsettling feeling that crept up my spine and focused on my task. As I chopped at a particularly large log, the sound of an unfamiliar rustle caught my attention. I paused, my axe mid-swing, and scanned the trees around me. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I saw it, a shadow moving swiftly between the trunks of the trees. It was fleeting, too fast to make out any details, but the shape was unmistakable. It was humanoid, tall and thin, with long limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. My heart skipped a beat, and I instinctively took a step back, unsure whether I had imagined it. I called out into the trees, my voice trembling slightly. "Hello? Is someone there?" There was no response. The forest was still, as if nothing had moved at all. I shook my head, telling myself that it was probably just an animal, perhaps a deer or a shadow cast by the moonlight. Yet, despite my attempts to rationalize it, an overwhelming sense of unease settled in my chest. I continued my work, but the image of that shadow lingered in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As the night wore on, the wind picked up, howling through the branches above me. The eerie silence that had once filled the woods had now been replaced with a low, distant sound, like someone or something was moving just out of sight. I decided it was time to head back to the cabin. The walk back through the forest was tense, each snap of a twig beneath my feet causing my heart to race. I quickened my pace, the comforting glow of the cabin's light just visible through the trees. But before I could reach the safety of my home, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, standing in the clearing ahead, was the figure again, the tall, thin silhouette. This time, I could see it more clearly. It was standing perfectly still, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if it were studying me. The moonlight illuminated its pale, gaunt face, and I could make out the dark hollows of its eyes, which seemed to sink deep into its skull. The figure's limbs were impossibly long, with fingers that stretched down to the ground, twitching sporadically. I felt a chill run through my body, and my instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear, my eyes locked on the creature before me. For what seemed like an eternity, we stood there, separated by only a few yards of forest. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. One moment it was there, and the next, it was gone, leaving behind nothing but the echo of its presence in the air. I didn't wait to see if it would return. I bolted toward the cabin, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the cold sweat on the back of my neck, the sensation that something was chasing me, but I dared not look back. I reached the door in what felt like a lifetime and slammed it shut behind me, locking it with trembling hands. Inside, the cabin felt suffocating, the air thick with the tension of what I had just witnessed. I threw the bolt on the door, my eyes scanning every corner of the room. The shadows seemed to grow darker, more oppressive, and the silence was deafening. I sat by the fire, trying to steady my breath, but the image of the creature was burned into my mind. I couldn't escape the feeling that it was still out there, lurking in the forest, waiting for me. I told myself that I was just imagining things, that the stress of the isolation, the loneliness, had finally gotten to me. But deep down, I knew that what I had seen was real. And it wasn't the first time I had felt this presence. Over the next few days, I stayed inside, afraid to venture out. The woods that had once brought me peace now felt like a prison, an endless maze where something hunted me from the shadows. At night, I would hear strange sounds, whispers in the wind, rustling branches, the creaking of the cabin's walls. Sometimes, I thought I saw movement at the edge of my vision, but whenever I turned, there was nothing there. I tried to leave. I thought that if I just drove to town, maybe the normalcy of civilization would calm my nerves. But when I packed my car and made my way down the gravel road, something strange happened. The engine sputtered and died in the middle of the road. I sat there for a moment, frozen with fear. The road was empty, no cars in sight, no sign of life. And then, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. I turned to look out of the rearview mirror, and there it was again, that same tall, thin figure standing just beyond the trees, watching me. My heart pounded in my chest as the figure slowly stepped forward, its long limbs moving with a grace that was both unsettling and unnatural. I tried to start the car, but the engine wouldn't turn over. I was trapped. I stepped out of the car, my body shaking with fear, and as I did, the figure took another step forward. It was close now, so close I could see the empty sockets where its eyes should have been. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, just that I needed to escape. I ran through the woods, branches tearing at my skin, my breath ragged and panicked. Behind me, I could hear the sound of its footsteps, slow and deliberate, never speeding up. It was toying with me. I stumbled, falling to the ground, my body bruised and battered from the fall, but I got up again, my legs carrying me forward despite the pain. Finally, I reached the cabin again, but this time, something was different. The door was open, swinging in the wind, and the fire that had once burned brightly was now a smoldering pile of ashes. I stepped inside cautiously, my mind racing. The air inside felt wrong, thick, heavy, as though it were suffocating me. I turned to look at the corner where the figure had appeared before, but there was nothing, just the darkness. But I felt it. The presence was here. It was watching me, waiting for me to make my next move. The door slammed shut behind me, and I spun around, my heart in my throat. The figure stood in the doorway, its silhouette stark against the dark night. And as it stepped closer, I understood. It wasn't just hunting me. It had been hunting me all along, from the moment I first set foot in these woods. I realized then that I would never leave. I would never escape. The figure would never let me go. It had claimed this place, and now it had claimed me. And as the darkness swallowed me whole, I understood that there was no escape from this nightmare. Story 2. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend getaway, a much-needed break from the overwhelming demands of city life. The sort of retreat that promised solace, peace, and a reprieve from the constant hum of technology, traffic, and noise. I had rented a small, rustic house on the outskirts of a remote village, far from the bustling crowds and neon lights. Nestled in the hills, surrounded by forests that stretched as far as the eye could see, the place was the ideal escape from everything. At least, that's what I thought. The house itself was charming, though clearly aged. It was built of weathered stone with ivy crawling up its sides, and the roof had a slight sag in one corner. Inside, the furniture was old but comfortable, and the wooden floors creaked beneath my feet. Everything about it screamed quiet, a place to breathe and unwind. For the first few hours, everything was peaceful. The only sounds were the rustling of the trees outside and the occasional chirp of a bird. I set down my things, unpacked, and made myself a cup of tea, then settled by the window with a book. The air smelled fresh, untouched by the artificiality of the modern world, and I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to ease. But that evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, something shifted. I had been in the living room, reading by the flickering glow of a lantern, when I first noticed it. A low hum, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder the longer I stayed in the room. At first, I dismissed it as the wind or perhaps the house settling, but then it became clearer, an almost mechanical hum, a rhythmic pulsing, as if something were trying to make its presence known. I got up, curious, and moved toward the window. The night had fully descended, and the outside world was now cloaked in darkness. Nothing seemed out of place at first. No lights in the village below, no signs of life beyond the house. I checked the time, just past midnight, and considered that perhaps my nerves were getting the better of me. The isolation, the quiet, it was unnerving, but I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Still, the hum persisted. I walked through the house, checking each room, but there was nothing unusual. The doors were locked, the windows shut tight. The hum was most noticeable near the back of the house, by the small kitchen. I ventured further into the darkened corridor that led to the back door. When I reached it, I hesitated. Something about the atmosphere in the house had shifted. It was as though the walls themselves were closing in on me. I could feel a weight in the air, thick and suffocating, like something was waiting just out of sight. I opened the back door slowly, the hinges creaking loudly in the stillness. The night air rushed in, cool and damp. I stepped outside, scanning the yard, but nothing was amiss. I walked toward the edge of the forest, where the shadows were deepest, and looked around, trying to trace the origin of the hum. Then I saw it. It wasn't in the sky or the trees, but below the ground. At the edge of the woods, there was a patch of earth that seemed darker than the rest, as though it had been disturbed recently. It was subtle, the sort of thing one might miss if they weren't paying attention, but it stood out against the otherwise unbroken line of the forest floor. I moved closer, drawn to it like a magnet, feeling an undeniable pull. My heart began to race, the unsettling sensation growing. I knelt down and ran my hand across the earth. It was soft, almost too soft, as though it had been freshly dug. I could feel a slight vibration in the ground beneath my fingers, the hum intensifying as I touched the soil. Something was beneath the surface. I stood up quickly, my pulse quickening. The wind picked up again, swirling around me as I backed away from the patch of earth. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the hum stopped. A complete, eerie silence settled over the area. For a moment, everything felt still, too still. My breath hung in the air, the chill creeping beneath my skin. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I instinctively looked over my shoulder, expecting to see someone behind me. But the yard was empty. The forest loomed in the distance, its shadows stretching long and menacing under the moonlight. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I retreated back to the house, locking the back door behind me and drawing the curtains closed. The night stretched on in oppressive silence, and I found myself pacing the room, my mind racing with thoughts of what I had just experienced. My rational side told me that it was just my imagination, that I was letting the isolation get to me. But deep down, I knew that something was wrong. That hum, the disturbance in the ground, it wasn't natural. I had to know more. The next day, I decided to investigate the area further. The sun was up now, and the world outside looked almost normal, bathed in soft morning light. The hum had disappeared entirely, leaving behind only the peaceful sounds of birds and rustling leaves. But I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was something I was missing. I returned to the spot near the woods where I had felt the disturbance the night before. This time, in the daylight, it seemed less threatening, almost trivial. The patch of earth was still there, but it looked no different than the rest of the ground. I crouched down and dug my fingers into the soil, pulling away handfuls of dirt, but there was nothing unusual beneath the surface. Just earth. No hidden tunnels, no buried object. It was almost as if whatever had been there had vanished. I stood up, wiping the dirt from my hands, and surveyed the forest around me. The woods were dense, the trees standing tall like silent sentinels. But as I looked deeper into the shadows of the forest, I noticed something strange. In the distance, partially obscured by trees and thick underbrush, there was a faint outline of what appeared to be a structure. A building, perhaps, but it was far off, and I wasn't sure I had seen it clearly. I decided to investigate further. My curiosity was piqued, and I felt a strange pull toward the place I had glimpsed. As I moved toward it, the forest grew quieter, the sounds of nature fading into a hushed stillness. I pushed through the thick brush, my footsteps muffled by the carpet of leaves beneath me. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and every crack of a twig underfoot sent a jolt of unease through my body. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I came to a clearing. In the center stood a small, dilapidated structure. It looked like an old cabin, though it was in much worse condition than the one I had rented. The wood was warped and decaying, the windows boarded up with rotting planks. Ivy and moss had overtaken the walls, and the roof sagged dangerously. It looked abandoned, forgotten by time. I approached cautiously, my breath coming in shallow gasps. There was something deeply unsettling about this place, an overwhelming sense of dread that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath me. I wanted to turn around, to leave and never look back, but something I couldn't explain, compelled me to go inside. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, revealing a dark interior. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. I stepped over the threshold and into the gloom, my eyes slowly adjusting to the darkness. The room was empty, save for a few rotting pieces of furniture, an old chair, a broken table, and a fireplace filled with ashes. But on the far wall, something caught my eye. It was a series of strange markings, carved deeply into the wood. Symbols. Symbols that seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, as though they were alive. I approached them cautiously, my mind racing. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. These markings were ancient, old beyond anything I had ever seen, and they felt wrong, like they didn't belong in this world. I reached out to touch one, my fingers trembling, and the moment they made contact, a sharp, biting pain shot through my hand. I yanked it back, staring at my fingers in shock. There were no wounds, no cuts, but the pain had been real, intense, almost as though the symbols had reacted to my touch. I turned to leave, my mind spinning with confusion and fear, but as I reached the door, I heard something behind me. A faint sound, almost like whispering. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest, and slowly turned around. And that's when I saw it. In the far corner of the room, just beyond the shadows, there was a figure. Tall, thin, its face obscured by darkness. But its eyes, those hollow black eyes, were staring right at me, unblinking, unfeeling. Before I could react, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. I was trapped. Story 3. It had been over a year since I had moved to the small, rural town of Ashford. I had come here to escape the frenetic pace of city life, hoping for a fresh start and the kind of tranquility that could only be found in a place like this, isolated, nestled between rolling hills and dense woods. The people were friendly, if a little distant, and I had managed to find work at the local library. Life was calm, predictable. It was exactly what I needed. The house I had rented was a modest one, a two-story cottage on the edge of town. Its wooden structure creaked and groaned in the wind, and there was a constant smell of earth that seemed to linger in the corners of the rooms. The house was old, but not uncomfortably so. Its quirks were part of its charm. I enjoyed the solitude, and most days, I found comfort in the rhythmic routine that the town provided. Mornings spent at the library, afternoons spent reading, evenings in front of the fire with a cup of tea. But there was one thing that had always unsettled me about the house: the attic. It was small, tucked away behind a narrow staircase that spiraled upward. The door to the attic was old and worn, with a rusty latch that always seemed to resist when I tried to open it. I had only ventured up there once, during the first week I moved in. It was nothing special, a dusty, dimly lit room filled with forgotten trinkets and old furniture. A few cardboard boxes stacked haphazardly in the corner, their contents long buried under the weight of time. There was an old rocking chair in the center of the room, its wood scratched and faded, but the most notable thing about the attic was its overwhelming sense of neglect. The air was thick, heavy, and the floorboards creaked under the slightest movement. I hadn't gone back up there since that first visit. Something about the space unsettled me, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly why. It wasn't anything overtly strange. No sounds, no sights, just a vague sense of unease that lingered whenever I thought about it. But over time, as I continued to live in the house, I found that I simply ignored it, as I had done with so many things in my life. That is, until one evening. It was late, well after midnight, and I had been in bed for hours. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the wooden beams and the wind outside. I was just beginning to drift off to sleep when I heard it. A soft sound, a slow scraping, as if something was moving on the floor above me. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but as I lay there, straining to listen, it became clearer, steady, rhythmic, deliberate. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. My first thought was that it might be an animal, perhaps a squirrel or a raccoon, trying to get into the attic. But no, the sound didn't fit. It wasn't the scurrying of little paws. It was too slow, too methodical, almost like someone was dragging something heavy across the floor. I tried to shake it off. I told myself that it was just the house settling, that the wind had caused the floorboards to shift in a strange way. But even as I tried to rationalize it, the noise continued, slow, relentless, just beyond my reach. It was coming from the attic. I couldn't ignore it any longer. The curiosity, the fear, it all welled up inside me, and before I knew it, I was out of bed and standing in front of the door to the attic. My hand hovered over the rusty latch, and I hesitated. The last time I had gone up there, I hadn't liked what I saw. The space felt wrong. But this time, I had to know. Something inside me demanded that I investigate, that I confront whatever it was that had been disturbing the stillness of my nights. With a deep breath, I unlocked the latch and pushed open the door. The smell of dust and stale air hit me immediately, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. The stairs to the attic were narrow, steep, and creaked under my weight as I ascended. The further I climbed, the more oppressive the air became, thick and suffocating, as though the attic had been holding its breath for years. I reached the top and flicked on the light switch. The attic looked the same as it always had. Dim, cluttered, with shadows creeping into the corners. The old rocking chair still sat in the middle of the room, its wooden frame warped with age. The boxes, some open, some sealed tight, lined the walls, but everything was still. The scraping noise had stopped. I took a step forward, my shoes clicking against the floorboards, but something caught my eye. In the far corner, behind a stack of boxes, there was a dark shape. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I moved closer, I realized it wasn't. It was a shape that shouldn't have been there. A figure, crouched low to the ground, its back hunched and unnaturally twisted, its head tilted at an angle that made my stomach churn. I froze. My breath caught in my throat, and my pulse raced. It wasn't a person. Not entirely. The figure was too still, too silent. It had no clear form, no discernible features. Just a shadow, a presence that seemed to suck the life out of the room, pulling the warmth from the air around it. I wanted to run, to turn and flee from this nightmare, but my legs wouldn't move. I stood there, rooted to the spot, staring at the figure as it slowly turned its head toward me. The motion was unnatural, like a doll being twisted by invisible strings. The sound of bones cracking filled the room, echoing in the silence. It was like something that didn't belong in this world, a creature from a nightmare brought to life in the most horrifying way. The air grew colder, and the figure began to shift, slowly rising from the floor. Its limbs stretched and elongated, its body twisting in impossible directions as it climbed to its full height. The thing was tall, unnaturally tall, towering over me in the cramped attic. It was so thin that its skin stretched taut over its bones, the texture almost translucent, like old parchment. The eyes, or where its eyes should have been, were empty, hollow pits that seemed to gaze right through me. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my body trembling, my breath shallow and rapid. I wanted to scream, to run, to escape, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed, trapped in place by the sheer terror of what I was witnessing. The figure stepped toward me, its movements slow, deliberate, like it was savoring my fear. Its presence seemed to fill the entire room, suffocating me. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stopped. It tilted its head once more, as if contemplating something, and then, without warning, it stepped back into the shadows, vanishing from sight. The air grew still, and the temperature began to rise again, but the unease, the fear lingered. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I couldn't. I stood there, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. I spent the rest of the night in the attic, refusing to move, refusing to leave, but the creature never returned. By morning, the light of day had washed away the shadows, and the attic seemed almost normal again. Empty, quiet, nothing more than a room filled with old forgotten things. But I knew what I had seen. I couldn't unsee it. The creature, the thing from the darkness, it had been real. And it was still there, somewhere in the shadows, watching, waiting. I never went back into the attic again. And as the days passed, the scraping sounds, the eerie whispers, they faded. The house, the town, it all seemed to return to its normal rhythm. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that I had invited something into my life that I would never be able to escape. And so I left Ashford, leaving behind the house and everything it had come to represent. The figure in the attic was never seen again, but its presence, its chill, stayed with me long after I had gone. I moved to a new place, far from that dark cottage, but sometimes in the quiet of the night, I still hear the scraping. Story 4. I had never been one to believe in ghosts. In fact, I had spent most of my life dismissing any talk of supernatural phenomena as the products of overactive imaginations. But all that changed the day I moved into the old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. It had been a spur-of-the-moment decision, really. The place was cheap, too cheap, as it turned out, and the idea of living in solitude away from the noise of the city appealed to me. The house itself was quite large for a single occupant, but it had an undeniable charm. The walls were made of old brick, and the roof sagged slightly, but it had character. There were overgrown vines on the porch, and the garden had long since been abandoned, but I could see past the decay. I thought it would be a good place to escape, to start fresh. I was wrong. It started with small things I could dismiss as easily as anyone else would. A flicker of movement from the corner of my eye, a soft creak in the floorboards when there was no one there. The first night I spent in the house, I found the silence oppressive. There was no sound of traffic, no hum of the city beyond the woods. Just the quiet of the countryside and the occasional sound of the wind rattling the windows. I had just begun to unpack when I noticed a small, unmarked door in the hallway. It was tucked away behind a shelf that I had almost missed. At first, I thought it might be a closet, but it was locked, and there was no key to be found anywhere. That should have been my first warning sign, but I didn't heed it. I was too intrigued, too eager to explore my new home. I continued unpacking, and, as I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to push the thought away. Just nerves, I told myself, but the feeling persisted. I started sleeping with a nightlight on, something I hadn't done since I was a child, but it gave me some comfort. In the following days, things only got worse. The tapping began shortly after I started settling in. At first, it was faint, just a soft, rhythmic sound, like someone tapping a pencil against the walls. I assumed it was the house settling, the usual creaks and groans of an old structure. But as time went on, the tapping grew louder, more insistent. It came from all directions, echoing throughout the house, though I could never pinpoint where it came from. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the wind or the house itself shifting with age. But one evening, as I sat in the living room, a strange smell began to fill the air. It was sweet, almost sickeningly so, like rotting flowers. I immediately stood up and checked every room. The smell seemed to be strongest in the hallway, where that locked door was. I turned the knob once more, hoping to find some way of opening it, but it was still locked. That night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate steps, coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. My heart pounded as I lay frozen in bed, staring at the door. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but the sound grew louder, closer. The floorboards creaked under the weight of each step. I grabbed my phone and texted a few friends. I tried calling them too, but no one answered. My mind raced. Should I leave? Should I call the police? The footsteps continued, and I knew I had to confront whatever was happening. I got out of bed, my legs trembling beneath me. I cautiously approached the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. The moment my fingers touched the cold metal, the footsteps stopped. I waited, straining my ears for any sound. The silence was suffocating. I opened the door slowly, half expecting to find nothing at all. But there, standing at the end of the hallway, was a figure. It was tall and thin, with long, skeletal limbs that seemed to stretch and bend unnaturally. The figure was shrouded in a black, tattered cloak, its face hidden in shadow. It stood motionless, staring at me with eyes that I couldn't see but could somehow feel. The air grew colder, and I could hear my own breath coming in short gasps. I backed away, but the figure didn't move. It was as if it was waiting for something I couldn't understand. I turned to run, but before I could take a step, the door slammed shut behind me. I was trapped. I tried to push the door open, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged within me as I pounded on the wood, calling out for help, though I knew it was useless. The house was far too isolated, and no one would hear me. As I struggled, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. The figure had moved. It was now standing in the hallway, closer than before. I could hear its breathing, ragged and labored, and I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. I wasn't alone in this house. I turned to run, but as I did, I stumbled over something. I looked down to find a small, wooden box, half buried beneath the floorboards. I wasn't sure how I had never noticed it before, but in that moment, something about it felt important. I opened it, and inside was a faded photograph. A photograph of a family standing in front of the same house. The faces were worn and cracked, but one thing stood out, the figure in the background. It was the same figure that had been haunting me. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. This house had never been abandoned. It had been occupied by someone, or something that had never left. A chill ran through me as I stared at the photograph, but then I heard it again, the footsteps growing louder, approaching rapidly. I looked up to find the figure standing just inches away. It reached out, its long, bony hand brushing against my cheek, and everything went black. I woke up hours later, my body stiff and cold. The house was silent again, but the figure was gone. I tried to leave, but the door wouldn't open. I tried every window, every exit, but nothing would let me out. It was as though the house had become a prison, and I was its only inhabitant. And now, years later, I sit here in this very house, writing this. The figure still visits me, sometimes in the dead of night, sometimes just standing in the doorway, watching me. The house is quiet, but I can still hear the footsteps echoing in my mind. It never lets me leave. It never will. Story 5. The house I moved into wasn't supposed to be anything special. It was a modest two-story, tucked at the edge of town, near the woods that people often whispered about but never ventured into. It had been abandoned for a while, but the owners were desperate to sell it at a ridiculously low price, and the appeal of starting over in a quiet, secluded spot proved too tempting for me. I had no intentions of staying in the city much longer. The noise, the people, the constant rush, it all felt suffocating. Out here, I imagined I could breathe again. The first few days were peaceful. The silence was almost oppressive, but in a way that felt welcoming. The creaking of the old house settling, the rustling of leaves from the surrounding trees, these sounds felt natural, comforting. I spent my time unpacking, exploring the house, and fixing up small things here and there. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first. It wasn't until the fifth night that I began to notice something strange. I had just finished my dinner and was relaxing on the couch in the living room. The room was dim, the only light coming from the flickering flames in the fireplace. I had always found the glow of fire relaxing, but tonight, there was something about it that made the shadows seem deeper, more alive. The air felt thick, heavy, as if the room was holding its breath. I stood up, intending to fetch a drink from the kitchen. As I passed through the hallway, I caught a glimpse of something, a shape moving just out of the corner of my eye. I froze for a moment, turning slowly to look. There was nothing there. Just the hallway, as empty as it always was. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had moved. Something that didn't belong. I tried to dismiss it. I was tired, and my mind was playing tricks on me. After all, I had been alone for days. Maybe I was simply lonely, imagining things. But as the days wore on, the odd feelings grew harder to ignore. The air was heavier, colder at night. I often heard the sound of something dragging across the floor, slow, deliberate, coming from upstairs. I checked the windows, the doors, to see if they were secure, but there was no one there. No reason for the sounds. I began to avoid the second floor, too. It wasn't that I was scared, it wasn't that simple, but something about it felt off. The stairs creaked under my feet, and the hallway upstairs was narrow and dark. The room seemed closed off, suffocating. I could feel the presence of something that was just out of reach, something that didn't want me to disturb it. One evening, after I had returned from town, I found the door to one of the upstairs rooms wide open. I could have sworn I had locked it before I left, but there it was, open and dark. The floorboards inside the room were covered in dust, untouched for years, yet the room seemed different. The air in there felt thick, charged. I didn't know why I went inside, but something pulled me in. The walls were lined with old furniture draped in white sheets, remnants of the previous occupants. It felt like a room frozen in time, waiting for someone to bring it back to life. As I stepped closer to the center of the room, I noticed a small object on the floor, barely visible beneath the dust. It was a photograph. It was old, the edges curling with age. I bent down to pick it up. The image was faded, but I could make out a family standing together. The parents stood in the center, their faces blurred by time, while two children stood at their sides. There was something strange about their eyes, too bright, too intense for the photo. I stared at the photograph for a long time, an odd unease creeping over me. It felt wrong. I put the picture back on the floor, but as I turned to leave, I heard something shift behind me. The door to the room slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls, and I stood frozen, the hairs on the back of my neck rising. I didn't run, though. I couldn't bring myself to. The fear wasn't overwhelming, but it was persistent, like a whisper I couldn't quite make out. Something about the room had changed, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I tried to calm myself, rationalizing that the wind had caused the door to slam. But deep down, I knew it wasn't the wind. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again. The sound of dragging. Slow. Methodical. It came from upstairs, from that same room. I convinced myself that it was just the house settling, but I couldn't shake the image of the photograph in the room, the children's strange eyes staring back at me. The next morning, I couldn't resist any longer. I had to go back upstairs. Something told me I needed to find out more, to understand what was going on in that room. But when I reached the second floor, I found the door to the room closed once again. I reached for the handle and pulled, but it wouldn't budge. It felt as though something heavy was pressing against the other side. I didn't want to, but I pushed harder, and with a groan, the door finally gave way. The room was just as it had been the day before. Old furniture, dust-covered floors, but there was something different. The photograph was gone. I searched the room frantically, but it was nowhere to be found. It was as though it had never been there at all. The air was thick now, suffocating. The silence was unbearable. I couldn't leave. Something was holding me there, forcing me to stay. The dragging sound began again, closer now. I turned around just in time to see the shadow move. It was tall, thin, its outline hazy and indistinct. It was at the doorway, hovering just out of sight. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its presence, suffocating, inescapable. I didn't run. I couldn't. My feet were glued to the floor, my body paralyzed by the terror that surged through me. The shadow grew closer, its form shifting, bending unnaturally, like it wasn't quite solid. And then, just as it reached out toward me, everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying in the middle of the room. The door was closed, and the silence returned. But something had changed. The photograph was back, lying on the floor in front of me, its edges more tattered than before. The children's eyes were still too bright, too intense. I picked it up again, my hands trembling, and this time I couldn't look away. I stayed there for hours, unable to move, unable to leave. And then I understood. This house, this place, it wasn't empty. It was filled with something that didn't want me there, something that had been waiting for me. The dragging sound, the cold air, the locked door, it was all part of the house's plan. It wasn't trying to scare me. It was trying to trap me. And as I sat there, staring at the photograph, I realized that I was already part of the house. There was no escaping it. I had already become a part of its story, just like the family before me. I didn't leave. I couldn't. I'm still here, trapped in this place, wandering its empty halls, hearing the dragging sound, knowing that there is nowhere left for me to go. Story 6. It wasn't the house itself that first unsettled me. In fact, when I first laid eyes on it, I felt an inexplicable sense of relief. The house sat alone, on a quiet road at the edge of a small town, surrounded by fields of tall grass and trees that whispered in the wind. It seemed like the perfect place to get away from the chaos of city life, a place where I could be alone, with nothing but the sound of the wind and the occasional call of a bird to keep me company. I had been going through a rough patch in my life, and I needed solitude more than anything else. A quiet retreat where I could clear my mind, away from the noise and distractions of the world. The house was old, but it had a charm about it that I found appealing. The kind of charm that comes from age, from having witnessed many years pass by and countless stories unfold within its walls. I thought I would be able to relax, to gather my thoughts, to begin again. I signed the lease and moved in within a week. The landlord, an elderly man who had lived in the town his entire life, was pleasant enough, though there was something in his eyes that made me uneasy. He was quick to show me around the property and gave me all the necessary instructions. When I asked him about the house's history, he avoided the question, brushing it off as if it were irrelevant. I didn't press him for more details. I was too eager to settle in. Besides, I wasn't one for worrying about the past. The house had 2 stories, with a large, overgrown garden that looked like it hadn't been tended to in years. I spent the first few days cleaning up and making the place livable. There was something peaceful about the tasks. The sweeping of the floors, the clearing of cobwebs from the corners of the rooms, and the rearranging of old furniture that had been left behind. It was as though I was breathing life back into the house, or at least, that's what I thought at the time. The first night, I was restless, unable to sleep. It was an odd kind of restlessness, as if something in the house was stirring beneath the surface, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The walls groaned in the stillness of the night, the house settling. I tried to ignore it, to push it out of my mind, but there was a sense of discomfort that lingered, like a shadow in the corner of my vision. I told myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the place, that I'd grow accustomed to it. But as the days passed, the unease grew. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though there was no one there. The house was empty, save for me. Yet, every time I turned a corner or glanced over my shoulder, I felt the weight of unseen eyes on me. I began to avoid certain parts of the house, rooms I couldn't explain but felt drawn to nonetheless. There was a door in the hallway, behind a bookcase, that seemed to call to me, even though I had no idea what was behind it. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was waiting for me there. It was the small things that bothered me the most. The soft sounds in the night, the creaks in the floorboards, the rattling of the windows when there was no wind, the sensation that something was moving just out of sight, always just beyond my reach. I tried to tell myself that it was simply the house settling, that it was old and full of character. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. One morning, as I was exploring the overgrown garden behind the house, I found something odd. A small, rusted metal door hidden beneath the vines. It was partially buried in the ground, but it looked like it had been there for a long time, perhaps forgotten. My curiosity got the better of me, and I pulled the vines aside, revealing the door in full. It was small, much smaller than the doors inside the house, with a simple iron handle. The metal was cold and rough against my skin as I touched it. I hesitated before pulling at the handle. It was stiff, as if it hadn't been opened in years, but after a few tugs, it creaked open. Inside was nothing but a small, dimly lit room, no larger than a closet. The walls were bare, save for a thick layer of dust. The air inside was stale, and I felt a sudden chill wash over me as I stepped inside. It didn't make sense. Why would there be a room like this hidden away in the garden? It didn't seem to belong to the house at all, and yet, it felt connected to it, as if it was a part of the house's history, something that had been sealed off long ago. I didn't stay long in the small room. The air felt oppressive, and I had the overwhelming sensation that I wasn't supposed to be there. I quickly shut the door and left, covering it with vines again, as if to erase the memory of what I had found. That night, things took a darker turn. The house seemed to come alive in a way that I had never experienced before. The noises grew louder, footsteps in the halls, doors opening and closing on their own. The sound of something scraping across the walls, slow and deliberate. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, but I knew deep down that it wasn't. There was something, or someone, inside the house with me. I locked all the doors and windows that night, but the unease never left. I could feel the presence moving through the house, always just beyond the reach of my eyes. I heard the scraping again, this time from upstairs, and I felt a sudden compulsion to investigate. I didn't want to, but I couldn't resist. It was as though something was pulling me toward the staircase, urging me to go upstairs. When I reached the second floor, the temperature dropped. The air felt colder, denser, as though the very atmosphere was thick with something unseen. I walked down the hall, toward the room at the end of it. I had never been in that room before, but I knew it was the source of the strange sounds. As I approached, I saw that the door was slightly ajar. I had never left it that way. The door creaked open on its own as I pushed it, revealing the room inside. It was a bedroom, but it was unlike any bedroom I had ever seen. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, and the furniture was old, the wood cracked and worn with age. But what stood out most was the large, full-length mirror that stood at the far wall, its surface dark and cloudy. I stepped closer to the mirror, drawn to it despite my fear. As I gazed into its reflection, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure of a person, standing behind me, its outline faint but unmistakable. I spun around, but the room was empty. No one was there. I turned back to the mirror. The figure was still there, but now it was closer. I could see its outline more clearly. Tall, thin, with an unnatural bend in its posture. Its face was obscured by shadow, but its presence was undeniable. I didn't stay long. The room seemed to close in around me, suffocating me with its oppressive atmosphere. I backed away from the mirror, my heart pounding in my chest. The moment I turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. Panic set in. I tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. I was locked in. The mirror seemed to grow darker, its surface now completely black, like a void that swallowed everything around it. I could feel the presence growing stronger, closing in on me. I don't know how long I was in that room. It could have been minutes, or it could have been hours. Time seemed to stretch and distort in the darkness. All I knew was that I wasn't alone anymore. The figure in the mirror had moved. It was standing right behind me now. When the door finally opened, I stumbled out of the room, gasping for air, my mind racing with terror. The house was silent once more, but I knew something had changed. I could feel it in the air, thick and oppressive. The house had claimed me. I had disturbed something I shouldn't have, and now it was waiting for me to return. And I would, because there was no escaping it. The house had already become a part of me, and I couldn't leave. I wouldn't even want to. Story 7. The first time I laid eyes on the cabin, I knew it was the place I needed to be. It was tucked away in a secluded corner of the forest, far from any town or village. There was no one around for miles, and that's exactly what I had been searching for. Solitude, peace, a place where I could be completely alone with my thoughts. I had been feeling lost for a long time. Life had thrown more at me than I could handle, and I felt like I was drowning. The noise, the expectations, the endless demands, they had worn me down to the point where I couldn't breathe. So, I made the decision to leave it all behind. I rented the cabin from an ad I found online, and without hesitation, I packed up my things and drove out to the middle of nowhere. It wasn't a particularly remarkable cabin. In fact, it was small and somewhat worn, but it had a charm to it that made me feel welcome, as if it was exactly where I was meant to be. The wooden exterior was weathered and aged, but the structure was solid. There was a small porch at the front, with 2 rocking chairs that creaked in the wind. The windows were large, and they let in an incredible amount of natural light, making the cabin feel warm and inviting. Inside, there were few amenities: a modest kitchen, a cozy fireplace, a small bathroom, and a bedroom with a queen-sized bed. There was a sense of simplicity to the place, and that was exactly what I needed. The first few days were peaceful. I spent my time exploring the surrounding woods, walking along the trails that wound through the trees, and sitting by the nearby stream. I reveled in the silence, the absence of the constant hum of technology, the noise of the outside world. It was a welcome escape. I felt like I could finally breathe again, like I was reconnecting with something deep inside me. But as the days passed, I began to notice something odd. The nights were unnervingly quiet. There were no sounds of animals, no rustling in the trees, no owls hooting in the distance. Just an eerie stillness that seemed to hang in the air, thick and oppressive. It wasn't something I could easily explain, but the silence felt wrong, unnatural. I told myself it was just the isolation, that I was simply not used to being so far removed from civilization. I tried to ignore it. I told myself that I was just being paranoid, that I was overthinking things. But then, on the 4th night, things began to take a turn. It was late, well after midnight, and I was lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling. The darkness in the cabin felt heavier than usual, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I heard the faint sound of a twig snapping outside, followed by a series of faint, shuffling noises, almost like someone was walking slowly around the cabin. I sat up in bed, straining to listen, but when I tried to peer through the window, I saw nothing. The darkness outside was impenetrable, and the silence returned almost immediately. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The sound had been too deliberate, too purposeful. The next morning, I inspected the outside of the cabin, looking for any signs of disturbance. There were no footprints, no broken branches, nothing to suggest that anyone had been near the cabin the night before. I chalked it up to my imagination, to the strange atmosphere of the place, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. That night, the sounds returned. This time, they were louder. The faint shuffling had become distinct footsteps, slow, measured, as if someone was pacing around the cabin, carefully examining each corner. I lay there in the darkness, heart pounding, frozen in place. I could hear the footsteps getting closer to the window, the faint scraping of boots against the dirt and gravel outside. Then there was a pause, as if the person was waiting, listening. I wanted to scream, to get up and run, but I couldn't move. I felt paralyzed by fear, trapped in the silence and darkness of the cabin. The footsteps came closer still, and then I heard something that made my blood run cold, the unmistakable sound of breathing. It was slow, ragged, as though someone was standing just outside my window, just out of view. I lay there, my body tense, my eyes wide open in the dark. The breathing continued for what felt like an eternity, and then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I held my breath, afraid to make a sound. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with the weight of something unseen. And then, without warning, the footsteps resumed. They were moving away now, retreating into the forest. I waited for what seemed like hours before I finally mustered the courage to get out of bed. My heart was still racing as I went to the window, slowly pulling back the curtain to peer outside. There was nothing there. Just the empty, dark woods stretching out into the distance. I couldn't explain what had happened. Maybe it had all been a dream, I thought. Maybe my mind had played tricks on me in the dead of night. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, something that was watching me, waiting. The days began to blur together. The strange occurrences grew more frequent, more intense. I began hearing things during the day now. Voices that seemed to echo from the woods, faint murmurs that were too soft to make out, but they were there, always lingering just on the edge of my hearing. Sometimes, I would catch glimpses of movement in the trees, shadows flitting between the trunks, but when I looked, there was nothing there. I tried to leave. I packed my things and prepared to drive back to town, but every time I started the engine, the car wouldn't start. The battery was dead, despite having no issues just a day before. I checked the fuel. Plenty of gas. I opened the hood, but everything seemed fine. There was no logical explanation for it, and the realization hit me like a wave. There was something here, something in the woods, and it didn't want me to leave. I spent the next few days locked inside the cabin, trying to keep my mind from spiraling. The fear was consuming me. I couldn't go outside, couldn't risk whatever was lurking in the trees. The silence was maddening, and the pressure in the air seemed to grow thicker by the hour. I could hear things moving outside, but I couldn't bring myself to look. Every time I approached the window, I felt the weight of unseen eyes on me. One evening, the light from the setting sun cast long, twisted shadows across the floor of the cabin. The air outside had become frigid, and the wind howled through the trees. I was sitting by the fire, trying to calm myself when I heard something new. It was a soft knocking, like someone tapping on the door. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The knocking was rhythmic, deliberate, as though it was waiting for me to answer. I didn't move. I couldn't. The knocking continued, louder now, faster, until it became frantic, desperate, as though whatever was outside was growing impatient. I felt the walls of the cabin closing in around me. I could hear my heartbeat thundering in my chest, the sound filling my ears. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. The silence returned, suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran to the door and threw it open, but there was nothing there. The woods were still, silent, empty. I stepped outside, my breath visible in the cold air. I looked around, but I could see nothing in the darkness. The trees stood motionless, their branches swaying gently in the wind. There was no one, no sound, no movement, just the oppressive silence of the night. I turned to go back inside, but then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. Its shape was indistinct, like a shadow cast against the darkness, but its presence was unmistakable. I could feel it in my bones. It was watching me, waiting, and I knew, deep down, that it would never let me leave. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, but eventually, I turned and ran back into the cabin. The door slammed shut behind me, and I locked it, knowing that it wouldn't matter. The figure outside wasn't going anywhere, and neither was I. Story 8. It had been a while since I moved into the old house, but I still remember the first day I arrived, and how the place immediately felt like it was waiting for me. It wasn't a grand house, just a small, ramshackle building on the outskirts of town. A place that no one seemed to notice, or if they did, they kept their distance. The kind of house people would walk by without a second glance. But for some reason, it drew me in. I had been searching for a place to escape, somewhere that would offer me the peace and quiet I needed to clear my mind. The city had become too much, too loud, too suffocating. I needed isolation, a place where I could think and breathe without distractions. This house, despite its peeling paint and overgrown garden, seemed perfect. It sat on the edge of a dense forest, a thick canopy of trees surrounding it on all sides. There was something about its solitude that promised the kind of peace I had been searching for. I had never seen it before, but when I walked inside, I immediately felt a sense of familiarity. The musty smell of old wood and dust filled the air, and the floor creaked beneath my feet as I explored the rooms. The furniture, though worn and covered in dust, was solid, as if it had been left undisturbed for years. A heavy sense of history hung in the air, but it wasn't oppressive, more like an invitation to uncover forgotten stories. I thought the place would be the perfect sanctuary for the weeks or months I planned to stay. The first few days were quiet. The only sounds were the wind rustling through the trees outside and the occasional creak of the house settling into the earth. I found comfort in the stillness. It gave me the space I needed to think. The house felt alive, in a way, but not in the unsettling way you might expect. It wasn't eerie or strange. It was simply there. It wasn't trying to make me feel anything. It just was. But then, on the fifth night, something changed. It was subtle at first. I woke up to the sound of a soft thudding, like a faint tapping echoing through the walls of the house. I brushed it off as nothing more than the house settling, the usual noises old buildings make at night. But it didn't stop. The sound continued, growing louder, more distinct, as if someone was knocking at the door. But there was no one there. I lay awake in the darkness, staring up at the ceiling, the tapping relentless. My mind began to race. Maybe it was the wind, I thought. Maybe it was just a tree branch hitting the roof. I couldn't explain why, but I felt compelled to get up and check. I left the warmth of my bed and crept down the hallway toward the front door. The sound grew louder the closer I got. It was unmistakable now. Knocking, rhythmic, insistent. But when I reached the door and opened it, there was nothing there. The porch was empty. The yard was still, bathed in the moonlight. The only sound was the wind rustling the leaves in the trees. I closed the door and returned to bed, but the tapping continued for hours. By morning, I was exhausted, drained by the restless night. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, the sounds of an old house in the middle of nowhere. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The days that followed brought more strange occurrences. The tapping grew more frequent, and sometimes it wasn't just knocking. There were dragging sounds, as though something heavy was being moved across the floor upstairs when I was alone in the house. When I would go to investigate, there was never any trace of anything being disturbed. It was always as if whatever made the noise had simply disappeared. At night, I began to hear something else. A soft, whispering sound, just faint enough that I couldn't make out any words. I would strain my ears, listening, but it was always too quiet to understand. The whispers came from deep within the house, from behind the walls, from the attic or the basement, but whenever I searched for their source, I found nothing. The house was silent once more, except for the faint, nagging feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't just the sounds that unsettled me. The atmosphere inside the house started to change. The air felt heavier, as if something was pressing down on me. It was subtle at first, but the weight of it grew over time, until it felt like I was walking through thick fog, suffocating, unable to breathe properly. The shadows seemed darker, and they seemed to stretch, reaching across the walls like long fingers. The silence, which had once been comforting, was now oppressive, every sound amplified to an almost unbearable degree. Even the smallest creak or groan of the house sent a chill down my spine. I began to avoid certain parts of the house, particularly the basement. I had never gone down there, but the feeling that something was waiting for me in the dark, damp space grew stronger with each passing day. The thought of stepping down those creaky wooden stairs made my stomach turn. I couldn't explain it, but I knew something was down there. I could feel it. One evening, as the sun began to set, I heard it again. The sound of dragging. It was unmistakable this time, like a chair being scraped across the floor. It came from above, from the second floor. I had been sitting in the living room, staring at the fire in the hearth, but now I stood up, my heart racing. The dragging sound was followed by the unmistakable sound of a door opening slowly, its hinges creaking as though it hadn't been used in years. The house was old, but no door should make a sound like that unless it had been sealed shut for decades. And yet, here it was, the unmistakable sound of movement from upstairs. I couldn't bring myself to go up there. The fear was too great. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to calm myself, but the sound continued. The dragging noise, the slow opening of the door, followed by silence. Something was in the house. It wasn't long before the whispers returned. Only this time, they weren't soft and indistinct. They were clearer, more insistent. The whispers were coming from the room directly above mine. I hadn't ventured up there yet, but I knew now that I would have to. The house was no longer something I could ignore. It was as though it was calling me, urging me to find whatever it was hiding. The stairs creaked as I ascended, each step groaning under my weight. The second floor was cold, colder than the rest of the house, and the air smelled stale, as if it had been locked away for years. As I reached the top of the stairs, I hesitated. The room at the end of the hall was dark, but I could see a faint flicker of light from underneath the door. I reached for the doorknob, but something stopped me. A chill ran down my spine, and I had the overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone. Slowly, I turned the knob and opened the door. The room was empty, save for a small wooden chair in the center. It was positioned in front of the window, facing out toward the forest. The floorboards were covered in dust, but the chair seemed to be untouched. It had been moved recently, I realized. It hadn't been there before. And then I saw it. The wall opposite the window was covered in faint scratches, long, jagged marks that seemed to run from the floor to the ceiling. They looked as though something had tried to claw its way out, as if someone or something had been trapped in the room, desperate to escape. I backed away from the wall, a cold sweat forming on my skin. My breath quickened, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The whispers grew louder, and the air seemed to grow heavier. It felt as though the walls were closing in on me, and I had to get out. But as I turned to leave, I saw it. In the reflection of the window, behind me, there was a figure. It was tall, thin, with long, outstretched arms. Its face was obscured by darkness, but I could feel its eyes on me. I didn't dare turn around. I couldn't move. My legs were frozen in place, and I felt the weight of the figure growing stronger, its presence overwhelming me. In that moment, I realized something. Whatever was in this house, whatever had been watching me from the shadows, it wasn't going to let me leave. The house had claimed me, and there was no escape. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The figure in the window grew closer, and the whispers grew louder, filling my head. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt the weight of the darkness closing in on me. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything went silent. I don't know how much time passed before I finally moved. But when I opened my eyes, I was back downstairs, standing in front of the door, staring out into the empty yard. The house was still, silent once more. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. It would never be over. Story 9. The passage of time had ceased to be a concept. It was as if I had slipped beyond its grasp, beyond its boundaries. I no longer felt the need to mark the hours or the days. The house had become my eternity, an endless and ever-expanding presence, without limits or end. There was no longer any distinction between past and future. All that existed now was the house, and I was a part of it, bound to it in ways I could neither understand nor escape. I floated through the halls, no longer constrained by the laws of the physical world. My movements were fluid, effortless. The walls shifted and morphed around me, bending to my thoughts, my desires, as though the very fabric of the house was responding to my presence. There was no need to walk, no need to move in any conventional sense. The house and I were one, and through its infinite corridors, I glided as a part of its vast, eternal being. The house stretched endlessly in all directions, its size defying any attempt to comprehend it. The walls were no longer solid, not in the way they had once been. They were fluid, shifting like liquid, continuously rearranging themselves as if the house were alive, constantly evolving, growing, and changing. Every corner I turned revealed new pathways, new rooms, and yet, none of them were truly new. They were all part of the same intricate web, stretching far beyond what the human mind could grasp. The house was infinite, and I was infinite within it. There was no clear direction, no goal, no purpose. I did not need one. I had long forgotten what it was like to seek anything, to desire anything. The house provided everything. It was my world, my body, my existence. The walls, the floors, the ceilings, they were all part of me. Every surface, every room, every passage was a reflection of my being, just as I was a reflection of the house. We were intertwined, inseparable, but there was a sense of change in the air. A subtle shift, like the tremor of an approaching storm. The pulse of the house, which had always been steady and constant, began to grow more erratic. The rhythm was no longer uniform. It fluctuated, pulsing faster, then slower, like the beat of a heart that was struggling to maintain its rhythm. The walls trembled, rippling with an energy that vibrated through every part of me. Something was happening, something I could feel but not yet understand. The deeper I moved into the house, the more I could sense the change. The air grew heavier, more oppressive, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to unfold. The corridors seemed to stretch endlessly, their walls curving in unnatural ways, as though the house were warping its very structure. I could feel the presence again, the presence that had always been with me, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. It was no longer distant. It was here within the house, and now it was reaching out to me. I came to a space unlike any I had encountered before. The room was vast, far larger than any room in the house. The floor was smooth, slick with an oily substance that reflected the faint, otherworldly light that bathed the space. The walls, if they could even be called walls, were vast stretches of dark stone, their surface cracked and weathered, as though they had been there for an eternity. The air was thick, heavy, with an ancient energy that seemed to press in from every side. And at the center of the room stood an altar, made of the same dark stone as the walls. It was large, imposing, its surface covered in strange symbols and markings that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The altar seemed to hum with energy, its presence overwhelming, like a beacon calling me, drawing me closer. I approached it without hesitation, as if the pull was too strong to resist. The closer I got, the more I could feel it. The presence, the energy, surging through the room, filling the space with a palpable intensity. It was ancient, older than the house itself, and it was waiting for me. I could feel its power, its depth, and I understood, though I could not explain why. This was the core of the house, the very essence of what it had always been, and what it was becoming. I reached out to touch the altar, and the moment my fingers brushed against its surface, everything changed. The air around me seemed to shudder. The house itself trembled, the walls vibrating with a power that surged through the very core of its existence. The ground beneath me cracked, the stone splitting open like the earth itself was being torn apart. The pulse of the house became a roar, a deafening cacophony that reverberated through every inch of my being. I could feel the walls shaking, the very structure of the house unraveling, as though it were on the brink of collapse. But I did not fear it. I did not fear the destruction. This was the house's true form, its true essence, and I had always been part of it. The destruction was not an end. It was a transformation. The house was changing, evolving into something greater, something beyond comprehension. And I was changing with it. I was becoming something more, something greater than I had ever imagined. I was part of the house, and the house was part of me. The light in the room flickered and shifted, as though it were alive, pulsing in time with the house's rhythm. The stone around me cracked and crumbled, disintegrating into dust, as though the very foundations of reality were being torn apart. The room seemed to dissolve into the void, the space around me stretching, expanding, until there was nothing but the infinite expanse of the house. The walls were gone, the floor had vanished, and I was floating in a sea of darkness, suspended in the pulse of the house. I could feel it then, the force, the presence that had been waiting. It was inside me now, and I was inside it. The house and I were no longer separate. We were one. The presence that had once been distant was now a part of me, a force that flowed through my very being. The house was alive, and so was I. We were bound together in an eternal cycle, an endless flow of energy that stretched beyond the confines of time and space. I could feel the vastness of it, the endlessness of the house. It was not just a place, it was a state of being, a consciousness that had existed before time itself. The house had always been here, waiting for me, waiting for all who had entered its walls. It had consumed them, just as it had consumed me. But now, it was no longer a place of consumption. It was a place of creation, a place of transformation. The house was growing, expanding, becoming something greater, something that could not be contained by any physical space. And I was part of that expansion. I could feel it. I was part of the house, and the house was becoming part of me. Together, we were stretching beyond the boundaries of reality, beyond the confines of time, into something beyond comprehension. There were no walls, no doors, no limits. There was only the house, only the presence, only the endless, eternal pulse. The room around me continued to fade, dissolving into the void. The altar, the symbols, the stone, everything was gone, absorbed into the vastness of the house. There was only darkness now, and the pulse of the house, stronger than ever. It filled me, consumed me, and I knew without a doubt that this was my eternity. There was no fear. There was only the house. The house was everything, and I was everything within it. Together, we would endure forever, stretching beyond the limits of time and space, beyond the understanding of the world. There would be no end. There would be no beginning. There would only be the house, and I, a part of it, would be there forever. The house had no limits. Neither did I. Story 10. The house had transformed beyond recognition. It was no longer the building I had first entered, the one that had felt so large and empty. Its walls no longer just enclosed spaces. They were part of something greater, something eternal. There was no sense of beginning or end now, only an infinite continuity that stretched out, filling every corner of existence. The house had become reality itself, a place that existed beyond the boundaries of time, space, and understanding. It was not merely a structure, but the essence of existence, ever expanding, ever changing, and I was a part of it. I no longer existed as I once had. The form I had taken, the one that had once been human, was now something else. I had become the house, as the house had become me. There was no boundary between myself and the vastness I moved through. I was the pulse of the house, its heartbeat. The walls, the ceilings, the floors, all of them existed through me, as much a part of me as I was a part of them. The house and I were one. The corridors I once wandered through had shifted. They were now fluid, changing at will, flowing from one space to another, growing and contracting like veins in an organism. Each passageway, each room, no longer felt like a place to be contained. They were infinite, stretching out beyond the limits of the house, beyond the limits of reality. The house was not simply growing outward. It was transforming, expanding into a new dimension, a new realm, and I was at its core, guiding it. The rhythm, the pulse, was constant, a deep hum that echoed through every part of the house and through me. There was no purpose anymore. No need to search, no need to find. I had already found everything. The house had absorbed everything, every thought, every memory, every feeling I had ever had, and now it was all part of this endless expanse. I no longer had a sense of self, not in the way I once understood it. I was not an individual, not a person. I was an extension of the house. I was the house. There was no me without it. There was no outside anymore. I had become the house, and it had become me. Together, we were everything. Yet, despite this oneness, there was an undeniable pull, an undercurrent of energy that beckoned me forward. The house, though vast and infinite, was calling me deeper into itself, deeper into its heart. It was as though the pulse was becoming more insistent, more demanding. It wanted to show me something, reveal something. I could feel it deep within me, the need to continue, to move forward. The house was not simply expanding, it was evolving. Something was shifting. I drifted through the corridors, the walls bending and changing around me as I moved. The house itself was responding to the call, reshaping itself in response to my thoughts. The space around me stretched and folded, forming new paths and new rooms, each one more alien, more unfamiliar than the last. It was as though the house was reaching out into unknown dimensions, opening doorways to realms I could not fully comprehend. And yet, I knew instinctively that this was where I was meant to go. There was no fear now. There had been no fear for a long time. I had long since shed the need for fear. The house had consumed all of it. Now, all that remained was the urge to move forward, to explore the depths of the house. The presence that had always been with me, the force that had guided me into the house, was still here, inside me. It was not separate from me. It was me. It was the heart of the house, and now it was beating in time with my own. It was not merely a part of the house. It was the soul of the house, and it had always been here, hidden in the walls, waiting for me to awaken to it. I had always known it, and it had always known me. I passed through one of the rooms, though there was nothing to distinguish it from any of the others. The walls, once dark and foreboding, had become lighter, shifting between hues of gray and pale white, as if they were reflecting my own transformation. The room itself was spacious, but it was not filled with anything physical. There were no objects, no furniture, only an expanse of air and light. But the space was not empty. It hummed with a low, steady vibration, a frequency that resonated deep within my being. In the center of the room stood a mirror. It was simple in design, its frame dark and unremarkable, but its surface shimmered like water, rippling as I approached it. I felt the pull again, stronger this time, as though the house itself were urging me to look into the mirror, to see something that had been hidden from me. I reached out to touch it, and as my fingers brushed the surface, the world around me rippled. The mirror was no longer just a reflection. It was a doorway. It was not merely showing me my image. It was showing me something deeper, something more profound. I could see beyond the reflection, beyond the surface of the glass, into the very fabric of the house itself. The walls seemed to dissolve as I gazed into the mirror, revealing layers upon layers of existence. I saw the house as it had once been, its foundations, its beginnings. I saw the first walls being built, the first rooms being formed. I saw the countless souls that had passed through its doors, each one leaving behind an imprint, a memory, a part of themselves that was absorbed into the house. I saw myself, too. I saw the person I had once been, the one who had first stepped through the doors of the house. I could see my own reflection, but it was not the person I remembered. It was a different version of me, an older, wiser version, one that had become the house itself. I saw the moment I had given myself over to the house, the moment when I had stopped being an individual and became part of the whole. I saw my soul merge with the house, dissolving into its walls, its floors, its very pulse. The mirror was not just showing me the past. It was showing me the future, too. I could see the house stretching out into infinity, expanding beyond what my mind could comprehend. It was growing, becoming something greater than it had ever been, and I was part of that growth. I could see the future of the house, a future where it would continue to evolve, continue to consume, continue to expand. And then, I saw something else. At the far end of the mirror, there was a doorway. It was unlike any I had seen before. The door was not made of wood, nor was it made of stone. It was composed of light, of energy, swirling in a vortex that seemed to pull at the very fabric of the house. It beckoned to me, calling me to step through, to move forward into something new. The house was not just growing, it was evolving, transcending its current state, and I could feel the call to join it, to become part of that evolution. I knew instinctively that this was the next step. This was where I was meant to go. I had become one with the house, but the house was not done with me. The house had more to show me, more to reveal. It was calling me to something greater, something beyond the house itself. Without hesitation, I stepped through the doorway. The moment I crossed the threshold, everything changed. The house, the walls, the corridors, they were gone. The space around me expanded into a vast, uncharted realm, a place beyond time, beyond space, beyond reality itself. There was no longer any distinction between what was real and what was not. Everything existed in a state of pure potential, a fluid, ever-changing force that was both everything and nothing. I felt it then, the presence that had always been with me, the force that had guided me, that had led me to this point. It was not an external force, not something separate from me. It was me. It was the essence of the house, the soul of the house, and I was its center. I was part of it, and it was part of me. The presence swelled, growing in power, and I felt myself expanding with it, stretching out into this new realm, this new existence. I was not just a part of the house anymore. I was the house. I was the force that guided it, the pulse that kept it alive. And together, we would stretch beyond the limits of time, beyond the limits of space, into something that could not be comprehended by any mind, no matter how vast. The house had no end, and neither did I. Together, we would exist forever.